Can you hear me? There it is. There it is. Okay, so I was introduced when I was here a few weeks ago, so we're going to just jump straight into the subject matter that I wanted to cover tonight. Jeff Miller is my name, if you didn't realize that from last time. And before we launch, I wanted you to be aware that the material that I'm going to be covering in this session is actually available in written and extended form in our Reason and Revelation that we have available on our website, where you can see this material. It's also in my Science vs. Evolution book as one of the appendices, and so you can either get one of my books or go and get this information on our website for free and check it out there. Now, why in the world do we want to take the time to discuss the multiverse? That seems like a pretty out there kind of subject to be taking any time on. Surely no Christian needs to really know much about this topic. What a waste of time, right? One of the guys in my college class back home, he actually a few years ago he came up, and I had covered the multiverse in one of our college classes, and then a couple weeks later he came up to me and said, "Man, I couldn't understand why in the world we were dealing with this multiverse stuff." And then the topic came up with a colleague that week whenever he was at work, and then he felt like he was ready to discuss the subject. So in this two-part article I wrote on this subject, which again is an appendix in this book, I cited from dozens of articles that are in virtually all of the major science magazines from the last several years, really the last decade. This has become a hot topic among the leading cosmologists, basically your Big Bang people that are developing the theory and promoting the theory in the secular arena among your naturalists and atheists. And so this is becoming more and more an important apologetics issue that we as Christians have to have a basic understanding of if we want to be able to reach especially the millennial generation and Gen Z after them. They are growing up hearing more about this because, again, it has taken kind of the center stage in the scientific arena among naturalists. And here's why. Here's why this has become such a big issue. When we examine the physical evidence, we find that there is just too much proof that establishes that the universe had to have a beginning, and at the same time we find that it could not have created itself, and we find there is so much evidence of design that there are the bulk of the leading naturalists are actually coming out and acknowledging that. They're admitting it. They're acknowledging that the evidence demands the existence of some realm outside of the natural universe, a supernatural realm. Now, obviously, they don't want to acknowledge that it is the heavenly realm spoken of in the Bible, and they wouldn't want to use the term supernatural to describe that realm, but they're acknowledging that there's got to be something outside of the universe. Notice what cosmologist Bernard Carr of Queen Mary University in London said: "If you don't want God, you'd better have a multiverse." Now, this statement is widely acknowledged, again, among the leading cosmologists. These are the guys developing Big Bang Theory. And many of the articles that I've read on the subject in the major science magazines all point back to this quote by Bernard Carr as their rationalization for all of the research they're doing on this multiverse topic. So as Christian apologists, 1 Peter 3:15, we're to always be ready to give a defense. We need to be ready to deal with the subject of the multiverse. As crazy as it is, you would think that you never would have to deal with this subject. And again, I would expect this to trickle down and become more and more prominent in the coming years. More and more people are going to know about this. So first of all, keep in mind the importance of evidence and proof before you come to believe something. If a person wants to be rational, what we call rational, then he can't have a blind faith. where he just believes in something without evidence or in spite of the evidence. Instead, a rational person is only going to draw those conclusions that are demanded or warranted by the evidence. And that is what the law of rationality says in philosophy, and this is a biblical idea as well. 1 Thessalonians 5:21, examine everything carefully, hold fast that which is good, or test all things, hold fast what is good. Before you believe something, you need to examine it, you need to test it, and only hold fast to those things that have been substantiated. And so this is a biblical idea, and you find this all over the place in the Bible, and we won't spend a lot of time discussing that. But the Bible teaches a rational faith, not a blind faith. So modern science, which is, again, dominated by naturalists who don't believe that anything supernatural ever happened. Now, modern science has historically agreed that evidence is necessary before you should come to accept something. And evidence is necessary if something is going to be scientific. And so they would claim to rely on direct observation, with the implication being that indirect evidence doesn't even count, is more the idea. And so this is one of their main arguments for pushing God out of the science classroom, because you can't directly witness, observe, and experiment on God. Now, they don't really hold to this rule in practice, but they still try to use it whenever they're trying to make a case against God or allowing the Bible in the classroom. So as we'll see, this principle, though, that they use to try to push us out of the classroom actually presents a major problem for naturalists when the finger is actually pointed at them, especially with regard to this multiverse idea. Okay, so the multiverse, first of all, we need to understand what the multiverse is, even what we're talking about, and then look at, is there actual evidence for its existence? Is this a rational theory, the idea of the multiverse? So the multiverse is the idea that our universe, with all of its space, its solar systems, galaxies, stars, planets, asteroids, comets, meteoroids, and so forth, everything that you can observe is not the only universe that exists. There are centillions of other universes that exist outside of our own. Essentially, an infinite number of other universes. We live not in a universe, but a multiverse. And when those other universes collide, they say, they will create their own Big Bang, and then other baby universes are then born. So what we want to do in this session is consider this multiverse idea to see if it does in fact provide a legitimate alternative explanation for the universe that doesn't require God, which is what he's saying, that, hey, the multiverse gives you another option. And so we want to consider that and see, okay, is that true? Is the multiverse something that atheists can point to and still be rational? So first of all, is there actual evidence for the multiverse? Some cosmologists attempt to find support for it through what's called string theory. In fact, well-known cosmologist George Ellis of the University of Cape Town in South Africa and astrophysicist Joseph Silks of Johns Hopkins University, here's what they said. Fundamentally, the multiverse explanation relies on string theory. So if string theory is true, it wouldn't necessarily mean that the multiverse is true. But in order for the multiverse to be true, it requires that this idea of string theory is true. So even before responding to the multiverse, we need to understand something now about what is called string theory. And don't worry, we're not going to get real deep into this idea, but modern physics is made up of really two branches. You've got physics that governs the macro realm, really the stuff that we can see. And so that branch would fall under Einstein's general relativity, and it includes the fields of astronomy and astrophysics and cosmology. But then you got the physics that governs the micro realm, so to speak. This is the tiny stuff you can't see. So this is the stuff at the level of particles and atoms. This is the stuff that is thought to make up all matter. So that realm would fall under what is called quantum mechanics. Now the problem is that the physics of these two separate realms, they don't jive, they don't work together. So they apply only in their separate domains, not in the domain of the other. So string theory was developed to try to bridge the divide between the two physics realms and try to unify everything into one so-called theory of everything. And it postulates that the stuff that makes everything else up is actually made of something like strings. And again, I don't want to get heavy into this, but the important thing about string theory is that it requires the existence of other unobserved dimensions. These are dimensions that you can't even perceive. These are beyond the dimensions of length, width, height, time. Okay, other dimensions beyond that we can't even perceive them. Now, string theory, it may be true. The jury is still out on that, but the key to remember is that even if it is found to be true, it still doesn't mean that the multiverse is true. But if string theory isn't found to be true, then the multiverse can't be true because, again, it relies on string theory being true. So the first problem with the multiverse is that string theory, which is a fundamental requirement of the multiverse, still has no tangible evidence to substantiate it. George Ellis said, string theory is not a tried and tested theory. It's not even a complete theory. Lawrence Krauss, who's a theoretical physicist and cosmologist of Arizona State University, said, there is no evidence that it is correct or that it can consistently resolve all the problems that a complete quantum theory of gravity must address. Astrophysicist Eric Chison of the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics, he said, although the theory of superstrings is now causing great excitement in the physics community, there is to date not a shred of experimental or observational evidence to support it. Ellis and Silk highlighted that not only is string theory unverified, it's not even testable. And so if it's not testable, then how can it even be scientific? And if other dimensions exist, according to string theory, and you can't even observe these, then how can string theory even qualify as a legitimate scientific theory? So obviously this is a move away from how naturalists have historically defined science, and it's a significant move because testability, again, has been a major argument that naturalists have used to push creation out of the classrooms and to reject the idea of a global flood, for example. And the unscientific nature of string theory is exactly what Ellis and Silk then point out. The name of the article that they were writing in was Defend the Integrity of Physics. And here's what they said about this. This year, debates in physics circles took a worrying turn. Faced with difficulties in applying fundamental theories to the observed universe, some researchers called for a change in how theoretical physics is done. They began to argue explicitly that if a theory is sufficiently elegant and explanatory, it need not be tested experimentally, breaking with centuries of philosophical tradition of defining scientific knowledge as empirical. We disagree. As the philosopher of science Karl Popper argued, a theory must be falsifiable to be scientific. Chief among the elegance will suffice advocates are some string theorists who rely on unobservable entities to validate their theories. These unprovable hypotheses, which they're talking about string theory and the multiverse, are quite different from those that related directly to the real world and that are testable through observations. As we see it, theoretical physics risks becoming a no man's land between mathematics, physics, and philosophy that does not truly meet the requirements of any. The issue of testability has been lurking for a decade. String theory and multiverse theory have been criticized in popular books and articles. So notice how far that naturalists are willing to go to avoid the idea of a God. So the debate between creation and evolution, between naturalism and supernaturalism, isn't even really about the evidence. Like which model can be shown to be actually backed by the empirical evidence. No. This is about God and the implications of his existence with regard to how we live. Now, to be clear, some physicists do draw a marked distinction between string theory and the multiverse. They argue, I believe correctly, that string theory is testable in principle because the strings that are hypothesized to exist in string theory are made up of matter, and so therefore they're potentially detectable. And that claim, I think, is true. It may be that string theory will one day be verified, but that's not the point that we're making here. The point is that until it is verified, those who want to point to the multiverse as actually legitimate evidence that shows that God doesn't need to exist, they have absolutely no scientific foundation upon which to launch a campaign for the existence of the multiverse. Those who believe in the multiverse hold to a belief in that without evidence. Their faith is blind, even though, again, the leading cosmologists have all turned to this. So also, once again, keep in mind that even if string theory does end up being true, it still doesn't mean the multiverse is true. If string theory is not true, however, then that small shred of hope that they had in trying to find at least a starting point for the multiverse theory disappears. All right, that's problem number one. String theory has no evidence. Number two, another reason why the multiverse is not a good alternative to God comes down to what's called inflation. So according to multiverse theory, when a new universe in the Big Bang begins, or in the multiverse begins, they have their own Big Bang and inflationary event, just like our universe allegedly did according to Big Bang theorists. So here's what inflation is. Inflation is this very brief period of time at the very beginning of the Big Bang where the entire universe is said to expand faster than the speed of light for just a short period of time. Now, this is a necessary part of the Big Bang in order to fix certain issues that the Big Bang has. And Big Bang theory is necessary to try to explain the origin of the universe without God. So in order to explain the origin of each of the universes in the multiverse, they're saying each of them had their own Big Bang and their own inflation. Now, the problem with that is, as with string theory, there is absolutely no evidence for inflation. Cosmologist and physicist Paul Steinhardt, this is the guy that actually helped to develop inflationary theory originally. He was one of the guys that pioneered the idea. He is now a scathing critic of it. In 2014, he wrote an article in response to the alleged evidence for Big Bang inflation. Naturalists thought they had finally found some evidence for inflation. The evidence ended up being false and not what it was hoped to be. But Steinhardt used that opportunity to criticize Big Bang theory and for those people that believe in that because they lack evidence for inflation. So in the article that was titled, "Big Bang Blunder Bursts the Multiverse Bubble," he explained that multiverse theory is the baby. It's the offspring of inflationary theory. But inflationary theory, he said, is immune to experimental and observational tests. Inflation does not end with a universe with uniform properties, but almost inevitably leads to a multiverse with an infinite number of bubbles in which the cosmic and physical properties vary from bubble to bubble. Scanning over all possible bubbles in the multiverse, everything that can physically happen does happen an infinite number of times. No experiment can rule out a theory that allows for all possible outcomes. Hence, the paradigm of inflation, and subsequently the multiverse, which hinges on it, is unfalsifiable. It's clear that the inflationary paradigm is fundamentally untestable and hence scientifically meaningless. So problem number two for the multiverse is that even if string theory were true, there's no evidence for Big Bang inflation, which is another necessary piece of the puzzle to try to prove that the multiverse actually exists. So problem number three, even if there were evidence for string theory and inflation, it still wouldn't prove that the multiverse exists. The multiverse has to have evidence of its own, but it has none, which would categorize it, again, as irrational to believe in that, and you would have to have a blind faith to believe in it. So this is a pointless attempt to bypass the existence of the God of the Bible. And remember, we have evidence for the God of the Bible. That's not a blind faith to have that, to believe that. But the multiverse has no evidence. So notice what Ellis said about this. He said, "We just do not know what actually happens, for we have no information about these regions and never will. All in all, the case for the multiverse is inconclusive. The basic reason is the extreme flexibility of the proposal. It's more a concept than a well-defined theory. The key step in justifying a multiverse is extrapolation from the known to the unknown, from the testable to the untestable," he said. Stephen Hawking, who was a theoretical physicist and cosmologist of the University of Cambridge, he's now passed on to meet his maker. But he advanced the multiverse idea as well, but he admitted that it's still just a theory. It's yet to be confirmed by any evidence, he said. Not only is there no evidence for the multiverse, but according to leading cosmologists, there can be no evidence for it. Tim Folger, writing in Discover, he's explained that for many physicists, the multiverse remains a desperate measure ruled out by the impossibility of confirmation. So notice what Ellis said. The notion of parallel universes, you want to know where the idea of the multiverse came from? It leapt out of the pages of fiction into scientific journals in the 1990s. This is a comic book idea. Many scientists claim that mega millions of other universes, each with its own laws of physics, lie out there beyond our visual horizon. In other words, you can't actually see this. You can't know it exists. They're collectively known as the multiverse. The trouble is that no possible astronomical observations can ever see those other universes. The arguments are indirect at best, and even if the multiverse exists, it leaves the deep mysteries of nature, which he says, for example, why does anything exist? It leaves these mysteries unexplained. All the parallel universes lie outside of our horizon and remain beyond our capacity to see now or ever, no matter how technology evolves. In fact, they are too far away to have had any influence on our universe whatsoever. That's why none of the claims made by multiverse enthusiasts can be directly substantiated. All right, so notice, according to this renowned, respected naturalistic cosmologist, observable evidence of the multiverse is impossible now or ever, and it doesn't even matter how much technology evolves. None of the claims of multiverse advocates can even be directly substantiated. Isn't it convenient that with the multiverse idea, naturalists have proposed a theory to try to explain away God, and that theory is immune to being falsified because it is known from the get-go, in their own words, to be forever inaccessible to observation. All right, the fourth reason the multiverse is not a valid alternative to God, as with inflation theory, the multiverse is untestable and it's unobservable, making it unscientific. Notice what astrophysicist and distinguished professor at Johns Hopkins University, Adam Rice, and astrophysicist Mario Livio said. Even just mentioning the multiverse idea raises the blood pressure of some physicists. The notion seems hard to swallow and harder to test, perhaps signifying the end of the classical scientific method as we know it. Historically, this method has required that hypotheses should be directly testable by new experiments or observations. All right, but observation, direct testing, experimentation, these are not possible with the multiverse. Krauss said, for many people, multiverses are indications of how far fundamental physics may appear to be diverging from what is otherwise considered to be sound empirical science. So the multiverse is not a scientific idea, even again, according to these leading atheists. Physicist Mark Buchanan, writing in New Scientist about the multiverse, he said, in bewilderment, fantasy is the very word that occurs to many, including some physicists, when they hear some of the ideas popular in cosmology. Inflationary cosmologists have opened the speculative throttle so fully that physicists now talk routinely of such things as an infinitude of parallel universes or a multiverse. Is this still science? Or has inflationary cosmology veered towards something akin to religion? Some physicists wonder, he said. By the end of the same article, his conclusion on the matter was clear. In the end, the multiverse isn't science so much as philosophy using the language of science, he said. So Lee Smolin is a theoretical physicist and faculty member at the Perimeter Institute for Theoretical Physics and adjunct professor of physics at the University of Waterloo. In an article titled, "You Think There's a Multiverse? Get Real," he said, "The multiverse theory has difficulty making any firm predictions and threatens to take us out of the realm of science. These other universes are unobservable. As attractive as the idea may seem, it's basically a sleight of hand, which converts an explanatory failure into an apparent explanatory success. The multiverse fails as a scientific hypothesis. Notice, We had to invent the multiverse. And thus, with an infinite ensemble of unobservable entities, we leave the domain of science behind. In some sense, the multiverse embodies the unreal ensemble of all possible solutions to the laws of physics, imagined as elements of an invented ensemble of bubble universes, but this just trades one imaginary unreal ensemble for another. Folger said, does it make sense to talk about other universes if they can never be detected? So, naturalists routinely argue biblical creation is unscientific, and therefore it shouldn't be allowed in science classrooms. I mean, God can't be directly observed. Creation can't be directly observed. The global flood cannot be reproduced scientifically in a lab. Well, in actuality, again, direct evidence for the truth of the biblical model is available, and abundant indirect evidence exists to substantiate what the Bible teaches as well. But even if it was the case that biblical creation is unscientific in that way, multiverse theory and inflation, along with the Big Bang, should, on the same grounds that they're using, be deemed unscientific by naturalists and left out of the science classroom. And of course, don't hold your breath on that, because that would require rational, consistent thinking to prevail among naturalists. I mean, after all, if you don't want God, you'd better have a multiverse. And in the words of Harvard evolutionary geneticist Richard Lewontin, natural scientists cannot allow a divine foot in the door, is what they come out and say. Problem number 5, even if we were to concede, for the sake of argument, that the multiverse exists. All right, next question, where did it come from? See, notice that the multiverse does not bypass the need for an ultimate creator. Notice what Ellis said. He said, many physicists who talk about the multiverse assume a multiverse context for their theories without worrying about how it comes to be, which is what concerns cosmologists. Scientists propose the multiverse as a way of resolving deep issues about the nature of existence, but the proposal leaves the ultimate issues unresolved. All the same issues that arise in relation to the universe arise again in relation to the multiverse. If the multiverse exists, did it come into existence through necessity, chance, or purpose? That's a metaphysical question that no physical theory can answer for either the universe or the multiverse, he said. Paul Davies was even more forthright about that. He's a theoretical physicist, cosmologist, astrobiologist, professor at Arizona State University. In an article for the New York Times entitled, Taking Science on Faith, he said, the multiverse theory is increasingly popular, but it doesn't so much explain the laws of physics as dodge the whole issue. There has to be a physical mechanism to make all those universes and bestow bylaws on them. This process will require its own laws or meta-laws. Where do they come from? The problem has simply been shifted up a level from the laws of the universe to the meta-laws of the multiverse. So at least some of these guys are still seeing this is not really fixing the problem. In 2011, he said, you still have to explain the multiverse. That still has laws. You need a universe-generating mechanism. So according to Davies, the multiverse theory is just moving the goalpost. It's not really answering the ultimate question. It's not leaving out the need for God. Michio Kaku is a theoretical physicist at the City College of New York. He agreed with Davies, but he went even further. In string theory, there are other universes out there. There's a multiverse of universes. The question is, where did the multiverse come from? You could argue, therefore, that maybe you need a God to create the multiverse, or a creator to create string theory, perhaps. So bottom line, even if the multiverse existed, it still doesn't remove the need for God. You need something that can create multiverses. All right, so again, the big picture of what we're addressing here, is the multiverse really a valid option for naturalists to use to replace the need for a God to create the universe? The sixth problem with that idea is that the multiverse theory itself admits that there must be another realm outside of ours, a super, not just a natural realm, a super, beyond, a supernatural realm has to exist. Something beyond nature, something beyond the physical realm that you cannot observe. So in other words, beyond our observable universe. So how can a person, notice, how can a person be a naturalist and still believe in the multiverse. Notice what Davy said. Clearly then, both religion and science are founded on faith, he means blind faith, namely on belief in the existence of something outside the universe, like an unexplained God or an unexplained set of physical laws, maybe even a huge ensemble of unseen universes too. So according to, again, leading cosmologists, the evidence from nature is leading them to accept the existence of supernature, just as theologians have long argued. So what are some of the evidences that these guys are seeing that are forcing them to that conclusion? This is what's amazing. I like what's called hostile testimony, where you actually let your enemies make the argument for you. It's like the best kind of testimony. The anthropic principle is the idea. This is their term. This is naturalists' term. The anthropic principle is the idea that the universe appears to have been made just for us. And the more that science learns about the universe, the more powerfully that truth is being driven home to these guys. So notice what Ellis and Silk came out and admitted. The multiverse is motivated by a puzzle. Why fundamental constants of nature, such as the fine structure constant that characterizes the strength of electromagnetic interactions between particles, and the cosmological constant associated with the acceleration of the expansion of the universe, why do these kind of things have values that lie in the small range that allows life to exist? Some physicists consider that the multiverse has no challenger as an explanation of many otherwise bizarre coincidences. The low value of the cosmological constant, known to be 120 factors of 10 smaller than the value predicted by quantum field theory, is difficult to explain, for instance. John Rennie, who's the editor for Scientific American, he pondered the nature of time itself. He said, the basic laws of physics work equally well forward or backward in time, yet we perceive time to move in one direction only, toward the future. Why is that? Why is the rule that time only goes in one direction? Why does it work that way? Well, that's a problem. Cosmologist and professor of physics at California Institute of Technology, Sean Carroll, he explained why this is a problem. If the observable universe were all that existed, right, so just our universe, if that's all that exists, it'd be nearly impossible to account for the arrow of time in a natural way. All right, oops. Apparently, there has to be something beyond the observable universe, beyond nature. Smolin admitted, everything we know suggests that the universe is unusual. It's flatter, smoother, larger, and emptier than a typical universe predicted by the known laws of physics. If we reached into a hat filled with pieces of paper, each with the specifications of a possible universe written on it, it's exceedingly unlikely that we would get a universe anything like ours in one pick, or even a billion. The challenge that cosmologists face is to make sense of this specialness of our universe, right? At first, inflation seemed to do the trick, but a closer look shows that we've just moved the problem further back in time. To make inflation happen at all requires us to fine-tune the initial conditions of the universe. Notice this kind of terminology? Fine-tune? Can you have fine-tuning without a tuner? In an article in Discover, Lee Folger quotes cosmologist and professor of physics at Stanford, Andre Lind. We have a lot of really, really strange coincidences. And all of these coincidences are such that they make life possible, Lind says. Physicists don't like coincidences. They like even less the notion that life is somehow central to the universe. And yet recent discoveries are forcing them to confront that very idea. Call it a fluke, a mystery, a miracle, or call it the biggest problem in physics. Short of invoking a benevolent creator, many physicists see only one possible explanation. Our universe may be but one of perhaps infinitely many universes in an inconceivably vast multiverse. Advocates argue that, like it or not, the multiverse may be the only viable non-religious explanation for what is often called the fine-tuning problem, the baffling observation that the laws of the universe seem custom-tailored to favor the emergence of life. If there is no multiverse, where does that leave physicists? If there's only one universe, Carr says, remember this is the guy that everybody quotes from, you might have to have a fine tuner. If you don't want God, you'd better have a multiverse. In other words, the evidence in nature is that there must be something beyond nature, something non-physical, to try to explain how perfect this universe appears to be for life to exist on Earth. Writing in New Scientist, Stuart Clark and Richard Webb said, we can't explain the numbers that rule the universe. The different strengths of weak, strong, and electromagnetic forces, for example, or the masses of the particles it introduces. Were any of them to have even marginally different values, the universe would look very different. The Higgs boson's mass, for example, is just about the smallest it can be without the universe's matter becoming unstable. Similar fine-tuning problems bedevil cosmology. Why is the carbon atom structured so precisely as to allow enough carbon for life to exist in the universe, he said. Theoretical physicist and professor at Columbia University, Brian Greene, commented on professor of theoretical physics at Stanford University, Leonard Luskind's thinking about the multiverse. He said, the multiverse is a highly controversial schema, and deservedly so. It not only recasts the landscape of reality, but shifts the scientific goalposts, questions once deemed profoundly puzzling. Why do nature's numbers, from particle masses to force strengths to the energy suffusing space, have the particular values they do? So questions like that would be answered with a shrug. Most physicists, string theorists among them, agree that the multiverse is an option of last resort. Looking back, I'm gratified at how far we've come, but disappointed that a connection to experiment continues to elude us, he said. Mary Jane Rubenstein, writing in New Scientist, she said, here's the dilemma. If the universe began with a quantum particle blipping into existence, inflating godlessly into space-time and a whole zoo of materials, then why is it so well suited for life? For medieval philosophers, the purported perfection of the universe was the key to proving the existence of God. The universe is so fit for intelligent life that it must be the product of a powerful, benevolent external deity. Or as popular theology might put it today, all this can't be an accident. Modern physics has also wrestled with this fine-tuning problem and supplies its own answer. If only one universe exists, then it's strange to find it so hospitable to life when nearly any other value for the gravitational or cosmological constants would have produced nothing at all. But if there is a multiverse of many universes, all with different constants, the problem vanishes. We're here because we happen to be in one of the universes that works. No miracles, no plan, no creator. So again, that's the argument. That's why they want to go with this multiverse idea. Again, the multiverse doesn't, remember, solve the problem because it's unscientific, being unobservable. It's irrational, having no evidence for it. It's contradictory to the naturalist because the multiverse itself is supernatural. And it's inadequate because it doesn't really solve the problem of origins. Remember, it just moves the goalposts. Something supernatural exists. So if you don't want to be beholden to a God, you're going to have to dream up something else. An infinite number of universes that demand that at least one of them will be as perfect as ours. That's what the multiverse is. Now the problem is that the multiverse, again, is still a non-natural, an unnatural idea. It contradicts naturalism. But naturalism is the standard dogma taught in science and in school classrooms. If the evidence points to the supernatural realm, then naturalism should be scrapped and you should consider the evidence to determine which supernatural realm is actually supported by the actual evidence. That's the real question here. Does the evidence support an imaginary multiverse with zero evidence? Or does it support a heavenly realm that is evidenced by a book that we have that has supernatural characteristics? Attributes of such perfection, of such divine nature that the brightest of the universe could not have possibly produced it. Well, I think the evidence is pretty clear which one actually fits, which one is the actual rational choice. One final problem with the multiverse. According to Ellis, in the multiverse, all that can happen happens somewhere in the many universes. He says, in seeking to explain why nature obeys certain laws and not others, some physicists and philosophers have speculated that nature never made any such choice. All conceivable laws apply somewhere. The idea is inspired in part by quantum mechanics, which, as Murray Gell-Mann memorably put it, holds that everything not forbidden is compulsory. All right, stay with me with these quotes here. Joshua Sokol, writing in New Scientist, explained that in the multiverse of eternal inflation, everything that can happen, has happened, and will probably happen again, he said. Lisa Grossman, writing in New Scientist, in such an infinite multiverse, everything that has even a slight chance of happening is virtually certain to happen. You just need to wait long enough, she said. Mark Buchanan, in the multiverse, every conceivable world exists. And individuals, notice this, and individuals identical to you and I live out parallel lives in places we cannot have access to. That's weird, isn't it? Steinhardt, he said, scanning over all possible bubbles in the multiverse, everything that can physically happen does happen an infinite number of times. Right now, all that said, if it is the case that in the multiverse, all that can happen happens, and every conceivable world exists, they said, if everything that has even a slight chance of happening is virtually certain to happen, if anything will exist an infinite number of times, if everything that can happen has happened and will probably happen again, if everything not forbidden is compulsory, then why would it not be the case that a God with the characteristics of the one in the Bible would exist in at least one of those universes? So doesn't the multiverse demand that God has to exist? And if not, why not? And if a God like the one described in the Bible does exist, that God is omnipresent. He's everywhere and every when. Psalm 139, 7-10, Proverbs 15:3, Ecclesiastes 12:4. That means if he exists in any one of those other universes, he exists here too. The multiverse really proves God exists. So the evidence is clear. There has to be something infinite beyond the physical universe that brought about the universe and its laws or its ordinances. There is zero evidence for a multiverse being that supernatural realm. In fact, by their own admissions, the multiverse leapt out of the pages of fiction into scientific journals. It is hard to swallow. It is a sleight of hand. It dodges the whole issue. It's imaginary, and it's even an oxymoron, one of these guys said. But all the while, there is ample evidence of another supernatural realm governed by the God of the Bible. He wrote the ordinance of the heavens. He set their dominion over the universe, Job 38:33. And by his word, the heavens were made, and all the host of them by the breath of his mouth, Psalm 33:6. All right, remember that you can read a more thorough treatment of this session on our website in the article, 7 Reasons the Multiverse is Not a Valid Alternative to God, or you can actually get access to this, to that article through my book, Science versus Evolution, which I brought one case of those books if you're interested in purchasing one of those. But other than that, that is all I have for tonight, and I appreciate very much your attention, and I'll see you again in a few weeks.